And tonight, I think, is the last night for our current strike, which has us over here on this backup channel for McDuff Lives. McDuff Lives is my main channel right now, and we should be broadcasting with that as of tomorrow. So thanks for joining here, and keep up with this channel as well, because you never know when strike two could hit us. It's uh, it's probably going to happen sooner or later. So thanks for joining. We've got about 250 people have subscribed here to McDuff Lives too. So if you haven't done that, please do, as it may be necessary to jump back here at any time. But we want to keep you in the loop. So that's a good way to do it. Thanks very much. And speaking of keeping in the loop, I am once again so happy to have Andy DeBala of Neighborhood News Studio producing the shows here for me down here on Mystery Island. And Andy has been also working very hard with George Webb. And you know what happened to George was Amazon dumped his entire library of books. One of the most devastating things I could imagine happening to any author. And but we all know that George has been over the target for quite some time, and he's going to take these hits, and I'm sure it's something that he just draws strength from, as he has said himself. So the Neighborhood News Studio, there we go, is our source for George Webb materials right now. If you are after getting some of his books, get in touch with them. They are printing them as fast as possible. I think there is one book left that's available right now, which is the Corona Roadshow. There's only, Andy told me, only 5 copies left. So get over to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com and connect with the studio there to support the work that they're doing. And a word about my own book. As you know, I've published my book, McDuff Lives, The Life and Untimely Death of Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr., and I have a copy of it behind me, and I have a copy of it in my hand. And this, again, is the work of Andy DeBala and the Neighborhood News Studio that did the printing, and a beautiful job. I'm really, really proud of the book and what they did, and it's very readable. There's sufficient pictures, and it's only about 72 pages long. So you can get this book on Kindle right now, and that's the only source for it. It's $9.99, which is the only reasonable price that I could put it at. And by the way, that makes me a little bit of maybe about $3 on a copy. So, but it's not about the money; it is about the content. And I really want everybody to start learning more details about my father's life, because we can use this life to pry open the door to, if not smash the CIA, at least to expose and cure the difficulties that we've been fighting with our whole lives. So, in fact, I do believe that I'll be probably putting together a kind of a more detailed course of my dad's life based upon this book, so that I could probably use the book itself as a textbook and go through and put more details and context as to the general history that we've been studying here for the past 4.5 years here at screamingospreys.com. So the plan is for the book to stay on Kindle for a while. As you know, I've put a number of hours in trying to figure out how to publish it on Amazon. The thing that happened with George Webb has kind of discouraged me from wanting to do any more business with Amazon myself, because who knows? It's the kind of thing that could happen to me, but more importantly, it did happen to George, and I object to that. So I'll be seeing what my options are. I hope that we can publish them certainly with Neighborhood News Studio. And if I'll probably be exploring other things like Apple eBooks and things like that. But um, if it's as complicated as the Amazon program, I'm not going to be able to manage it. So that's where we're at. I really do hope that everybody does. I hope you don't mind the $10 price tag. It's kind of like the work that I've done for 4 to 10 years, and so I hope that you think it's a fair price. If you got 10 books, 10 bucks, then you can get a copy of the book. And by the way, print it out if you want. Put it in a 3-ring notebook. Pass it around to your friends. Make copies for your friends if you want to get together with people and make some copies and read it together. I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a kind of a course, maybe 5 weeks or something like that, to go through the book in detail and try to bring out the very important points that I'm really trying to pass on to everybody to improve the future of this country and our kids and everything good like that. So that's my hope, is that folks will take advantage of the availability over at Kindle, $9.99, and Amazon Kindle. But it'll be a little while probably before we can put anything in terms of a paperback or hardcover, for the logistical reasons. Plus, I really want Andy to concentrate on supporting George. So, and we've got a nice 4th of July weekend coming up. So, happy 4th of July. All right, so that's where we're at. And now I'm going to get back into the swing of my show after having taken a good bit of liberty with you guys so that I could concentrate on getting the book written. But I'm back to one show a day. Today I've got a special show this morning with Doug Valentine. If you haven't seen that, check it out right away. It's extremely exciting and a wonderful interview, and gives me the firm confirmation that we do know who my dad was and what he did, with regard to trying to stop the CIA's drug importation programs. Amazing. So that's right here on this channel, McDuff Lives 2. I think it's already been published. So what's been on my mind? I've been reading a couple of books at the same time, as I usually do, and I'll just bring them to your attention. The first one is Trading with the Enemy, the Nazi American Money Plot, 1933 to 1949, by Charles Higham. Trading with the Enemy is a gold mine of information as to exactly that: the collusion, the treason, the obvious transgressions of national interest by the biggest corporations, the most prestigious names, and the most elite families in our country and in the world. So this book by Charles Higham, published, I see it, in 1984. You can get a paperback copy for only $579, but I think you can get the Authors Guild back imprint.com edition that I got for substantially less. So don't be discouraged by that price. Really, if you want to learn more about the details of this stuff, this is a great book. And have you heard of the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS? Okay. I think that's where I want to start with this book. It's chapter 1, A Bank for All Reasons. And I'm going to read a little bit about this. On a bright May morning in 1944, while young Americans were dying on the Italian beachheads, Thomas Harrington McKittrick, American president of the Nazi-controlled Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, arrived at his office to preside over the 4th annual meeting in time of war. This polished American gentleman sat down with his German, Japanese, Italian, British, and American executive staff to discuss such important matters as the $378 million in gold that had been sent to the bank by the Nazi government after Pearl Harbor for use by its leaders after the war. Gold that had been looted from the national banks of Austria, Holland, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, or melted down from the Reichsbank holdings of the teeth fillings, spectacle frames, cigarette cases and lighters, and wedding rings of the murdered Jews. The Bank for International Settlements was a joint creation in 1930 of the world's central banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Its existence was inspired by Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, Nazi Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, part of whose early upbringing was in Brooklyn and who had powerful Wall Street connections. He was seconded by the all-important banker Emil Poole, who continued under the regime of Schacht's successor, Dr. Walter Funk. Sensing Adolf Hitler's lust for war and conquest, Schacht, even before Hitler rose to power in the Reichstag, pushed for an institution that would retain channels of communication and collusion between the world's financial leaders, even in the event of an international conflict. All right, so that's my first little, what I call a speed bump. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because this is the point of this BIS is to keep business as usual going between banks, no matter whether there's a world war or not. That should be chilling. That is what the BIS was built for, and that is the purpose for which it was used and still continues to be used. So, it's a total separation of the interests of the bankers from the political interests of people. And so then all they need to do is stir up some conflict between us, and we have to go to the bank to get some money to buy some arms from the same people that own the bank, and there we go. Well, it was written in the bank's charter, concurred in by the respective governments, that the BIS should be immune from seizure, closure, or censure, whether or not its owners were at war. These owners included the Morgan-affiliated First National Bank of New York, among whose directors were Harold S. Vanderbilt and Wendell Willkie, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Bank of Italy, the Bank of France, and other central banks established under the Morgan banker Owen D. Young's so-called Young Plan. The BIS's ostensible purpose was to provide the Allies with reparations to be paid by Germany for World War I. The bank soon turned out to be the instrument of an opposite function. It was to be a money funnel for American and British funds to flow into Hitler's coffers and to help Hitler build up his war machine. The BIS was completely under Hitler's control by the outbreak of World War II. Among the directors under Thomas H. McKittrick were Hermann Schmitz, head of the colossal Nazi industrial trust I.G. Farben, Baron Kurt von Schroeder, head of the J.H. Stein Bank of Cologne, and a leading officer and financier of the Gestapo, Dr. Walter Funk of the Reichsbank, and of course, Emil Poole. Emil Poole's name is P-U-H-L, by the way. These last two figures were Hitler's personal appointees to the board. The BIS's first president was the smooth old Rockefeller banker Gates W. McGarrah, formerly of the Chase National Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank, who retired in 1933. His successor was the 43-year-old Leon Fraser, a colorful former newspaper reporter on the muckraking New York World, a street corner soapbox orator, a straw hat company director, and performer in drag on stage comedies. Fraser had no background in finance or economics, but he had numerous contacts in high business circles and a passionate dedication to the world of money. In the first 2 years of Hitler's assumption of power, Fraser was influential in financing the Nazis through the BIS. When he took over the position of president of the First National Bank in its Manhattan headquarters in 1935, he continued to exercise a subtle influence over the BIS's activities that continued until the 1940s. Well, the BIS became a bête noire of the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. And we find Henry Morgenthau to be a good guy in this particular fight, objecting to the interaction between the American banks and American corporations and Nazi banks and Nazi corporations. He and others were involved in a knockdown, drag out bureaucratic fight over whether or not America would trade with the enemy. And this fight is recounted very well in the book called Trading with the Enemy. Charles Higham, 1984, I believe. In March of 1938, when the Nazis marched into Vienna, much of the gold of Austria was looted and packed into vaults controlled by the Bank for International Settlements. The Nazi board members forbade any discussion of the transaction at the BIS summit meetings in Basel. Cochrane, in his memoranda to Morgenthau, failed to score this outrageous act of theft. The gold flowed on into the Reichsbank under Funk in the special charge of Reichsbank Vice President and BIS Director Emil Pohl. On March 14, 1939, Cochrane wrote to Morgenthau, quote, "I've known Pohl for several years, and he is a veteran and efficient officer." He also praised Walter Funk. His timing was not good. One day later, Hitler followed his forces into Prague. The storm troops arrested the directors of the Czech National Bank and held them at gunpoint, demanding that they yield up the $48 million gold reserve that represented the national treasure of that beleaguered country. The Czech directors nervously announced that they had already shifted the gold to the BIS with instructions that it be forwarded to the Bank of England. This was an act of great naivete. Montague Norman, the eccentric Van Dyke-bearded governor of the Bank of England, who liked to travel the world disguised as Professor Skinner in a black opera cloak, was a rabid supporter of Hitler. On orders from their German captors, the Czech directors asked the Dutch BIS president to return the gold to Basel. The president held an anxious discussion with BIS General Manager Roger Aubin of the Bank of France. The result was that Bayan called London and instructed Norman to return the gold. Norman instantly obliged. The gold flowed into Berlin for use in buying essential strategic materials toward a future war. So this first chapter just documents the fact that the BIS was controlled by Adolf Hitler. And yet our corporations were clearly doing business with it and yielding to its demands, just like Chamberlain yielded to Hitler the Sudetenland. So skipping forward a little bit through the book, because I want to give you a bit of all of it here. It was only appropriate that Thomas Harrington McKittrick should have been amply rewarded by Winthrop Aldrich, John D. Rockefeller's brother-in-law, because Joseph L. Larkin, one of Aldrich's most trusted vice presidents in charge of European affairs, figured prominently in the fraternity. And the fraternity is what the author calls this group of businessmen that will continue doing business with each other regardless of whether there are wars, whether their countries are at war or not, the business as usual crowd. And of course, the Rockefellers the Aldriches and Thomas Harrington McKittrick are part of this. The Rockefellers' Chase National Bank, later the Chase Manhattan, was the richest and most powerful financial institute in the United States at the time of Pearl Harbor. The Rockefellers owned Standard Oil of New Jersey, the German accounts of which were siphoned through their own bank, the Chase, as well as through the independent National City Bank of New York, which also handled Standard, Sterling Products, General Aniline and Film, SKF, and ITT, whose chief, Sosthenes Bain, was a director of the National City Bank. Two executives of Standard Oil's German subsidiary were Karl Lindemann and Emil Helfrich, prominent figures in Himmler's circle of friends of the Gestapo, its chief financiers, and close friends and colleagues of the BIS's Baron von Schroeder. Larkin kept the Chase Bank open not only in the neutral countries of Europe and South America, but in Nazi-occupied Paris throughout World War II. After Pearl Harbor, Chase's Paris branch provided financial arrangements for the German embassy and German businesses in Paris under the, quote, guidance of Emil Poole's right-hand man at the Reichsbank, Hans Joachim Caesar, and with full acceptance of New York. In common with most members of the fraternity, Winthrop Aldrich was politically schizophrenic, capable of playing both ends against the middle in the interests of big money. On the one hand, he was a most generous supporter of Great Britain in her beleaguered state, raising millions for British war relief in a campaign that in 1942 earned him audiences at 10 Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. Yet, with great duplicity, he turned a blind eye to Larkin's continuances of the Chase interests and banking headquarters in occupied Paris. Joseph Larkin resembled Aldrich in his immaculate tailoring, perfect manners, austere deportment, and in his dedication to the fraternity, a distinguished member of a Roman Catholic family. He had received the Order of the Grand Cross of the Knights of Malta from Pope Pius XI in 1928. He was an ardent supporter of General Franco, and by natural extension, Hitler. Morgenthau first suspected him as a fascist sympathizer in October 1936 when Fernando de los Rios, the ambassador of Loyalist Spain, dedicated to Franco's defeat, went to see Larkin to open an account of $4 million. The account was to be used to raise local assistance for the Spanish government, including the Lincoln Brigade. Larkin said firmly that the $4 million account would not be allowed. Larkin went a step further in the service of fascism. When the Loyalist government deposited a similar amount in the Chase Bank in Paris, Larkin was furious with his subordinate who accepted the account. He immediately contacted the Loyalist embassy in Paris and had him withdraw the deposit. Simultaneously, with the encouragement of Schacht, Larkin took on the Franco account and the Reichsbank account, though the Reichsbank was under the personal control of Hitler. In 1942, introducing a book called Patents for Hitler by Gunther Riemann, the lawyer Creekmore Fath wrote, since the middle 30s, whenever a German business group wanted to make an agreement with any business concern beyond the borders of Germany, it was required first to submit a full text of the proposed agreement to the Reichsbank. The Reichsbank rejected or rewrote until the agreement met its approval. The Reichsbank approved no agreement which did not fit into the plans of the Nazi state and carry that state another step toward its goal of world domination. In other words, any American firm which reached an agreement or dealt with a German firm was dealing with Hitler himself. I think there's a lot of resonance here. This is my second speed bump of the evening when I read that any agreement that did not fit in, the Reichsbank approved no agreement which did not fit into the plans of the Nazi state and carry that state another step toward its goal of world domination. In other words, anyone that wanted to make an agreement with them was dealing with Hitler himself. So this is what resonates to me is the Green New Deal, where we have the experts from LaRouche and Schiller have told us in many ways, and I'm convinced of it, that the idea behind the Green New Deal is to reduce our industrial capacity and allow them to control all the means of production. And this is all done through financing, just like the building of the Nazi state was done through financing. So the idea that banks will only lend money to projects that fit within their idea or the World Economic Forum's idea of the Green New Deal, then you're not going to get financing for your business, for your project, whatever it is. And so that I think is a clear resonance between what was happening. And I'm not saying that there's any comparison to the Nazis' horrors, but in a sense, it is about domination of the world through domination of the economies of the world. Pardon me a second. Chapter 3, The Secrets of Standard Oil. In 1941, Standard Oil of New Jersey was the largest petroleum corporation in the world. Its bank was Chase, its owners the Rockefellers. Its chairman, Walter C. Teagle, and its president, William S. Farish, matched Joseph Larkin's extensive connections with the Nazi government. 6'3" tall and weighing over 250 pounds, Walter C. Teagle was so large a man that it was said that when he stood up from his seat on the subway, it was to make room for two women. He smoked Havana cigars through a famous amber holder. He spoke with measured deliberation, fixing his fellow conversationalists with a frightening, unblinking, and powerful stare. Teagle came from a prominent Cleveland family, just below the millionaire class. He early showed a dominant will expressed in a thunderous voice, a humorless intensity, and a rugged disrespect for those who questioned his judgment. He was known as a dominant presence at Cornell. Kept out of football by an injury, he worked off his colossal injury in school debates, where he invariably won hands down, entering the Standard Oil empire under the wing of John D. Rockefeller I. He rose rapidly through his Horatio Alger concern for work and his strong international sense. He drew many foreign countries and their leaders into the Standard Oil web. He weathered scandal after scandal in which Standard stood charged with monopolistic and other illegal practices. From the 1920s, Teagle showed a marked admiration for Germany's enterprise in overcoming the destructive terms of the Versailles Treaty. His lumbering stride, booming tones, and clouds of cigar smoke became widely and affectionately known in the circles that helped support the rising Nazi Party. He early established a friendship with the dour and stubby Hermann Schmitz of I.G. Farben, entertaining him frequently for lunch at the Cloud Room in the Chrysler Building, Teagle's favorite Manhattan haunt of the late 1920s and the 1930s. Teagle was also friendly with the pro-Nazi Sir Henry Detterding of Royal Dutch Shell, who agreed with his views about capitalist domination of Europe and the ultimate need to destroy Russia. Teagle, Schmitz, and Detterding shared a passion for grouse shooting and game hunting. They vied with each other as wing shots. Teagle's love of hunting deer and wild birds was to earn him the admiration of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. Teagle was close to Henry Ford. He first met him in the early 1900s when he wanted to make a deal for oil with a new Detroit auto assembly shop. He walked into the shop, saw how miserably run down it was, and decided that he would have difficulty in collecting for the gasoline contract. But he took a chance on the thin, gaunt proprietor and went ahead. Many years later, the two men met again and formed a friendship. Ford looked at him sharply and said, "We've met before." Teagle remembered at once. "Sure," Teagle said. "I sold you your first gasoline contract. You were stripping down a Winton chassis." Ford replied, "I was. And I was so hard up I didn't even own the goddamn thing." Because of his commercial and personal association with Hermann Schmitz and his awareness that he must protect Standard's interest in Nazi Germany, Teagle made many visits to Berlin and the Standard tanks and tank cars in Germany throughout the 1930s. He became director of American IG Chemical Corporation, the giant chemicals firm that was a subsidiary of IG Farben. He invested heavily in our American IG, and American IG invested heavily in Standard. He sat on the IG board with fraternity brothers Edsel Ford and William E. Weiss, chairman of Sterling Products. Following the rise of Hitler to power, Teagle and Hermann Schmitz jointly gave a special assignment to Ivy Lee, the notorious New York publicity man who had for some years worked for the Rockefellers. They engaged Lee for the specific purpose of economic espionage. He was to supply IG Farben, and through it the Nazi government with intelligence on the American reaction to such matters as the German armament program, Germany's treatment of the church, and the organization of the Gestapo. He was also to keep the American public bamboozled by papering over the more evil aspects of Hitler's regime. For this, Lee was paid first $3,000, then $4,000 annually, the money paid to him through the Bank for International Settlements, in the name of IG Chemie. The contract was for obvious reasons kept oral, and the money was transferred in cash. No entries were made in the books of the employee companies or in those of Ivy Lee himself. After a short period, Lee's salary was increased to $25,000 per year, and he began distributing inflammatory Nazi propaganda in the United States on behalf of IG Farben, including virulent attacks on the Jews and the Versailles Treaty. In February 1938, the SEC held a meeting to investigate Nazi ownership of American IG through a Swiss subsidiary. The commissioners grilled Teagle on the ownership of the Swiss company. He pretended that he did not know the owners were IG Farben and the Nazi government. Teagle was sufficiently embarrassed by the hearing to resign from the American IG board, but he retained his connections with the company. He remained in partnership with Farben in the matter of tetraethyl lead, an additive used in aviation gasoline. Goering's Air Force couldn't fly without it. Only Standard, DuPont, and General Motors had the rights to it. Teagle helped to organize a sale of the precious substance to Schmitz, who in 1938 traveled to London and, quote, borrowed 500 tons from Ethel, the British Standard subsidiary. Next year, Schmitz and his partners returned to London and obtained $15 million worth. The result was that Hitler's Air Force was rendered capable of bombing London, the city that had provided the supplies. Also, by supplying Japan with tetraethyl, Teagle helped make it possible for the Japanese to wage World War II. There was a further irony. The British Royal Air Force had to pay royalties to Nazi Germany through Ethel Standard for the gasoline used to fly Goering's bombers that were attacking London. The payments were held in Germany by Farben's private banks for Standard until the end of the war. So, an American corporation controls the ethyl lead, tetraethyl lead, an additive used in aviation gasoline. Goering's Air Force couldn't fly without it. But these guys are shooting partners. They go out and kill grouse and deer and things, and then they sit around and drink and talk about what great shots they were. And this is a class of people that we don't know these people. They're in a different world. And so there's a certain idea that they're above the rest of us that exists right here in this clear relationship between the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, IG Farben, um, and Schroeder and the Schroeder Bank that we just don't teach in school. And this has to be taught in school. This book is one of many, but I think it's a seminal book, and it's as you can tell, it's very nicely written, very easy to read. So this is the kind of information that I think everybody needs to share. I'm going to skip forward to page 43 and talk about Harold Ickes, Ickes, who is another guy like Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, who is constantly complaining about the apparent ties between Standard Oil and IG Farben and other oil companies and the Nazis in different forms that I'm not going to read all of tonight. But just think of Standard Oil as the iconic uh, version of this. I'm sorry, I think it's Ickes or Ickes. Ickes, I'm going with. Yeah. Ickes constantly complained to Roosevelt that Teagle and Farish were prominent on various government boards, including the War Petroleum Board, and that American car owners were forming gas lines while the Germans and Japanese had all the gas they needed. Roosevelt was furious. On June 22, 1941, Roosevelt sent Ickes a rude and peremptory letter on the matter of his restricting oil. He pinned his ears back once and for all by instructing him to release the shipments by arrangement with Cordell Hull. That same day, Ickes wrote in his diary a statement that was censored out of the published version that for 2 years now the president had broken promise after promise to him, and that he had even begun to lie to him unashamedly. He added that he had often wondered if he could not be of greater assistance to the people on the outside by telling the truth, rather than staying inside helping to deceive. He was referring to the fact that Roosevelt and Hull were lying to the public about the extent of exports to belligerent powers. More and more in 1941, Ickes was cut down by pressure from Standard Oil on the State Department. In June, states sent a Caribbean division him to the Caribbean division without even consulting him. That allowed, I'm sorry, I misread that. In June, states set up a Caribbean division without even consulting him. This allowed shipments to Axis influenced neutral countries from Standard and other wells in Venezuela for transshipment via the refineries in Aruba. 3.5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Ickes really had his fingers chopped off. Without telling him, Roosevelt set up a committee under the Economic Warfare Council, later the Board of Economic Warfare, which was to handle all duties and responsibilities on the matter of exporting petroleum products. To Ickes's horror, William S. Farish, his right-hand man, Max Thornburg, was appointed Foreign Petroleum Coordinator. With Farish and Harry D. Collier on the board, Thornburg, a smart executive, received $8,000 a year from the State Department for his job and $13,000 a year from Standard Oil. Ickes was so maddened by this sign of alleged corruption and collusion that he called Vice President Henry Wallace at home on January 4th, 1942, and demanded to know why Wallace, as Economic Warfare Council chairman, could tolerate such an arrangement. Ix charged Thornburg with being ambitious, not over-scrupulous, capable of being disloyal, and he insisted to Wallace that Thornburg had schemed for the appointment and even presented Roosevelt with a letter authorizing his appointment standing over the president while it was signed. He said that this indicated the degree of influence Standard Oil had at the White House. Wallace did not reply. Throughout the early months of 1942, Ix kept hammering away at Wallace to have Thornburg dismissed. Frustrated in his efforts, he charged Wallace with, quote, trampling on his enemies and betraying his friends. His hatred for Wallace matched his hatred for Thornburg. With his stubborn sense of integrity, he simply did not understand that in order to win the war, Roosevelt and Wallace had to get into bed with the oil companies. And that, I think, is a big point to make, that in order to win the war, Roosevelt and Wallace had to get in bed with the oil companies. So what does that mean, really? That we have oil companies that are allowing the special aviation fuel to go to the Nazis, to fuel their warplanes, to kill our soldiers, to destroy our ships and our tanks and our everything, that they are doing that because they have a special tetraethyl lead gasoline that can only be made by these American corporations. And the American corporations have found loopholes and ways to sell it to the Nazis, and so they do. And this is called business as usual. There is precedent in that we now see business as usual means we turn away. We don't look when things happen, How long will they kill our profits while we stand aside and look? It's Bob Marley's question, and he didn't live a whole long time either. So how can we let this obvious truth happen, that the Nazis could not have fought the war without Standard Oil's gasoline? They couldn't have fueled their tanks. They couldn't have fueled their planes. They couldn't have fueled their warships. The Americans couldn't fight the war without Standard Oil's oil. They couldn't fuel their Liberty ships and their destroyers and their tanks and their LSTs and LCVPs and all of the great vessels that were invented to win that war. Couldn't fuel them. Couldn't fly any planes. Nobody could fly planes. So what is it? Why is it that somebody like Walter Teagle doesn't just say, hey, you know what? You guys have got to stop fighting, okay? We're just turning off the oil. Everybody go home. I'm taking away the football. Game's over. You can't have any more oil until you settle down and learn how to play nice. Why wouldn't somebody do that had that kind of power? It could have stopped all of that, how many hundreds of millions of people that were displaced, and I mean, what is it, 20, 30 million people killed, and then the terrible torture psychologically and every other way of so many people. There's no way for me to understand how a person that could stop that from happening by simply turning off the pipelines. Why wouldn't you just turn off the pipelines? Well, that's because those people aren't free. They're part of this imperial system that we keep talking about here on my channel that it still exists and is basically the forces that have been trying to take America back into the British Empire and with the allies in Europe, of course. So this is the story of trading with the enemy. Charles Higgins' book. There's another great chapter here about IT&T, and well, there's so much good stuff here. Maybe I should read some more another night. But the telephone plot. This is chapter 6. I'll do a little of this. During the early days of 1942, Carl Lindemann, the Rockefeller Standard Oil representative in Berlin, held a series of urgent meetings with two directors of the American International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, Walter Schellenberg, head of the Gestapo's counterintelligence service, the SD, and Baron Kurt von Schroeder of the BIS and the Stein Bank. The result of these meetings was that Gerhard Westrick, the crippled boss of ITT in Nazi Germany, got aboard an ITT Focke-Wulf bomber and flew to Madrid for a meeting in March with Sosthenes Bain, American ITT chief. In the sumptuous royal suite of Madrid's Ritz Hotel, the tall, sharp-faced Bain and the heavily limping Westrick sat down for lunch to discuss how best they could improve ITT's links with the Gestapo and its improvements of the whole Nazi system of telephones, teleprinters, aircraft intercoms, submarine and ship phones, electric buoys, alarm systems, radio and radar parts, and fuses for artillery shells, as well as the Focke-Wulf bombers that were taking thousands of American lives. Sosthenes Bain, whose first name was Greek for life strength, was born in St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, on January 30th, 1882. His father was Danish and his mother French-Italian. He and his brother Hernand, later his partner, were schooled in Corsica and Paris. In 1906, Bain and his brother took over a sugar business in Puerto Rico and snapped up a small and primitive local telephone company by closing in on a mortgage. Realizing the potential of the newfangled telephone, Bain began to buy up more and more companies in the Caribbean. Bain became associated with AT&T, of which Winthrop Aldrich was later a director. In 1920, Bain's work in the field of cables enabled him to set up the ITT with $6 million paid in capital. He soon became the telephone king of the world, making deals with AT&T and JP Morgan that resulted in his running the entire telephone system of Spain in 1923. His Spanish chairman was the Duke of Alba, later a major supporter of Franco and Hitler. In 1930, Bain obtained the Romanian telephone industry, to which he later added the Hungarian, German, and Swedish corporations. By 1931, his empire was worth over $64 million despite the Wall Street crash. He became a director of, inevitably, the National City Bank, which financed him along with the Morgans. Bain was aided by fascist governments, into which he rapidly interlocked his system by assuring politicians promising places on his boards. He ran his empire from 67 Broad Street, New York City. His office was decorated with Louis XIV antiques, rich carpets, and portraits of Pope Pius XI and various heads of fascist states. He traveled frequently to Germany to confer with his Nazi directors Kurt von Schroeder and Gerhard Westrick. On August 4th, 1933, he and his representative in Germany, Henry Mann of the National City Bank, had a meeting with Hitler that established a political relationship with Germany that continued until the end of World War II. The Fuhrer promised aid and protection always. Through Mann, Bain was closely connected with Wilhelm Kepler, who formed the Circle of Friends of the Gestapo and introduced him to Schroeder and Westrick. Not only did Kepler, Schroeder, and Himmler see to it that Bain's German funds and industries were untouched by forfeit or seizure, but Schroeder arranged for Emil Pool at the Reichsbank to pay off ITT's bills. Bain became an important aide to his friend Hermann Göring. In 1938, he and Schroeder obtained 28% of the Focke-Wulf Company. They greatly improved the deadly bomber squadrons that later attacked London and American ships and troops. When Austria fell in 1938, Bain organized his Austrian company under the management of Schroeder and Westrick and aided in the expulsion of Jews. Some Nazis tried to take over the Austrian offices, but Bain again visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden and made sure that IT&T would be allowed to continue in business. Well, that chapter, the telephone plot, goes on for quite a few more pages. The book itself serves as an indictment of tremendous force of Standard Oil and IT&T. And in the context of my history of my father that I've written, the connection between IT&T and the Hartford Fire Insurance Company starts to get more and more interesting in that merger that was ultimately approved by my father's cousin, the congressman from Connecticut, William Cotter. That merger was under a lot of scrutiny from the SEC for a long time. And was this something that goes back to the Nazi days when IT&T was doing business, trading with the enemy? Well, that's the story of banking and business as usual as conducted by what Charles Higham calls the fraternity. And this fraternity is obviously a consortium of men with no morals, no consideration for the goodness of humanity, and an oligarchical attitude that they have something that we don't. Well, that's the old European attitude of all men are not created equal. But this nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's one of the things that makes this country unique and worth saving. Thanks for being with us tonight. It's good to be back.